Getting the right spring for my rear shock proved to be quite successful. So I thought, hang the expense, let's get new springs for the front forks. The NC's 5 years old now, so the fork springs could well become quite droopy by now. This is something I've noticed in other aspects of life, so why shouldn't it happen to the fork springs? My previous upgrade to the forks was just installing the PD valves. This was definitely an improvement, so maybe the springs could improve it even more. Anyway, we're off for our morning coffee. It's a cool, foggy morning, and we're heading to Jerry's at Culnura. Back in the shed, and the fork springs have arrived. These are the springs that are designed for the NC750X, so let's get them out and have a look. The standard spring is a progressive spring, but these aftermarket ones aren't. I'm not convinced that progressive springs are much of a benefit anyway, so these will be good. A progressive spring has a tighter wind at the bottom, and theoretically this means that the spring tightens up as it gets to the end of its stroke. I want to measure the forks before I put the new ones in so that I can compare what the new ones do compared to the what I've got as standard. So I've got the front of the bike jacked up so I can measure the full extension of the fork. I don't have any lovely assistants available today, so I have to do this all myself. With just a stick under the side stand, I can get the bike pretty well upright, so this measures the static sag. At full extension I've got 180mm, and at static sag I've got 137, which is 3, carry the 1, what's that, 4, okay. So 43mm static sag. That seems quite a lot, especially considering I've already got 2 turns on my spring preload adjusters. So now to measure the sag when I'm just sitting on the bike. I'm just putting a cable tie on the fork, just not real firm, put it down the bottom, and then just gently sit down on the bike, which will compress the springs further. Now I can measure from the top of the fork to the bottom of the cable tie. Okay, so that's 116. So the difference between those two figures are 21, which is sort of more in the ballpark between the static and the rider changes. But bear in mind, this has got preload on the spring of 2, not 3, as I've written down. Because I've changed the fork oil quite recently and I'm inherently a lazy mongrel, I'm just taking the springs out from the forks without pulling the forks out of the bike. But the socket is not long enough to go over those spring preload adjusters. Oh poo. But wait, I've got an old 1973 set of sockets that I can mongrelise. So using one socket, I can weld it onto the top of the other socket. But the big socket needs to be drilled out so that it has enough space to go over the adjuster. Now I could use the drill press to drill this out, but it's much easier on the lathe. There we go, nice big hole. Let's just make sure it's big enough. Yes, that will work perfectly. Time to weld the other socket onto it. I've probably mentioned before that I'm just a backyard self-taught tinkerer, but it's so nice to have a few tools to do this sort of stuff. You never know when you might need them. My custom-made third hand comes in handy here to hold that socket in place as I stick the two sockets together. Well, here we go. Here's a thing of beauty. And next time I need to take off those caps, I'll have a tool to do it. Before I take out the fork caps, I put the bike on the centre stand and jack up the front so that when the fork cap comes out and the fork depresses, the front end doesn't slump and the bike fall over. The custom socket works a treat. With the cap off, I can slide out the spacer with a little bit of wiggling. Now, using a bit of wire with a hook on it, I can hook onto the spring. Now there's a washer that sits on top of the spring, so I'll grab that first so I don't lose it. Now I can just hook the spring out slowly and carefully so any oil that's on it will drain off. There's a tiny bit of residue of oil, but it won't be enough to affect the oil levels. Here's the old and new spring together. The new springs are shorter than the standard ones. This is because they're meant to go with the PD valves. Now when I put the PD valves in, I shortened my spacers. Now those spacers are now too short. They need to be 40mm longer. So it's down to the workshop in the back shed and measure the outside diameter of those spacers. And I happen to have some PVC pipe which will do the job perfectly. So now it's just a simple job of cutting a couple of lengths of this PVC and Bob's your uncle. Oh, what a miracle! They're both exactly the same length. So now if I put the old spring and the old spacer and the new spring and the new spacer, we have the same length. Yee-haw! So now it's just a simple matter of popping the spring back in, let it drop down, and now the washer, drop that down as well. And then the spacer. Takes a bit of woggling because the handlebars are in the way a little bit. There we go. Done. Putting the fork caps on is always the worrying bit for me. The threads are very fine and it's very easy to get them cross-threaded if you're not careful. But these ones go back in reasonably well. So the job's almost done. Now, to measure what the new forks are at. we've got 154 static sag, which is 26. Aha, that sounds a bit better. And with the rider sag, 137, which is 17. That's not very much. Now remember, I've got the spring preload set, so I can let off the spring preload and then remeasure and see what that looks like. Okay, so now we've got 124, which gives us now 30 mil sag with the rider on, and I'm happy with that. Oh, but oh dear, what have I done? That's right, I was so concentrating on the sag with the rider on that I got off the bike and forgot that the side stand wasn't down, and so the bike went straight over. Oh dear, another idiot moment. There seems no end to the things that I can do wrong, but no damage done. The Barkbusters saved the day. So, remember, it's always handy to have the side stand down when you hop off the bike. Let's have another review of these measurements from the old and the new. So we've got 116 to 124, so that gives me an extra 8 mil of fork length when I'm sitting on the bike, and that's close enough for me. So as we continue our ride to Jerry's for morning tea, I'm testing out the new fork springs. A little bit of gravel with some corrugations in it helps to get the feel. And yes, they have actually improved the feel of the front end. Probably about as much as the PD valves did. They feel as though I've got a longer stroke in the spring now. So the bike tends to float over those corrugations just a little bit better than with the standard spring. Well, the 5-year-old standard spring anyway. So all in all, I'm happy with the investment, and it was an easy job to replace. It's 8 AM on a Saturday, and the regular crowd's motored in. There's an old man sitting next to me, making love to his GS BM. He said, "Mate, the repayments are killing me," as the smile ran away from his face. "I believe I could be a real chick magnet if I could live down BM ownership disgrace."
Ready, Harley? Shake hands. Good boy. Okay, shake hands, Thelma. Good boy. Good boy. Good puppies, that's all.